And all right. Boom, 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 boom. There we go. Excellent. All right, so hello everyone. As you're jumping on, feel free to put in the chat where you're from, like PJ did. Curious where you're all tuned in from. I'm in Idaho. We got an Idaho right here. San Carlos. Ooh. Booming through loud and clear. So the other thing about this little the different setup here, Brian, is it pulls all the comments from all the different places it's streaming and puts it on the screen, so you can see them.
Oh,
Can't
that's
you?
neat. Yeah, I sure can. Yeah. Wow. Amazing. We got people around the world, and I see some familiar names and old friends. Good to see you all. And many folks I haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet.
Oh yeah, but yeah. So this is a little different from last time with the little restream thing. I think it makes it a lot easier, because before I would have to have multiple things open to look at all the comments everywhere, and now they're just sitting there. So there we go. Excellent. Well, thank you all for hopping in. We got we got to give shout outs to the reading group from the First United Methodist Church there. There are 5 of them. Constance is on. Yeah, so there's a number of different reading groups. Some are participating live. Some sent in the top question, having discussed part 1, Brian.
Oh, great.
So, yeah, it's going to be fun. All righty. Well, I'm going to hit record, and then we can have ourselves some fun. There we go. Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and this is session 1 of the live stream Hangouts with Brian McLaren as part of the Do I Stay Christian reading group. We have already provided for everyone in the group a guide for the 3 different parts of the book. Obviously, Brian wrote and read for the audio version the book Do I Stay Christian, and we only got 78 questions on part 1, Brian. I've organized them by topics so that the most popular topics we'll get to, and then a few people use some of the same phrasings. I pick one. There's a couple of them that are amalgamation questions, but I tried to organize it so we get to as many of the different topics that come up.
Great.
And there's a number of them that gave long personal stories where I'll just say it traumatic or big or beautiful or something, so that we don't have to hear the whole story. Because I didn't reply to all of them and go, you do know if I read this whole thing, it's on the internet, right? So there's that.
Yes.
So before we jump in, like tell us how's it been getting to talk to people about the book? We recorded the book previews and everything before it's gone out in the world, and
That's
now
right.
it's been out. So
That's
how's
right.
it been?
Well, it's been phenomenal. I just got back from England and Ireland, and I spoke at the Greenbelt Festival, which has, I don't know how many people there this year, 10,000 plus, I suppose, and had wonderful crowds there and great questions, great discussion. Yeah, everywhere I've gone, it's been remarkable, and people asking good and difficult questions and sharing a lot of very intense personal stories too. I should say, I'm recovering from COVID. I managed to not get it until about a week ago, so I'm feeling the best I felt in about a week. But if I seem a little bit low energy, that'll be why.
Well, if you need me to just send some energy your way, Brian, I can, because I'm just excited
You've
that I get to talk
always
to you.
got plenty.
Well, I think one of the places to begin is there were a couple people who were in the group you and Diana and I did last year, looking at 20 years after 9/11.
Yes,
And
and here we are.
the
Yeah.
anniversary, and you tell the story at the beginning of the book about the senator running for president and saying like, "Oh, I'm going to take out Medina
Yeah.
as a threat to Muslims." Um, I wonder if, like on this anniversary, how you are picking up those conversations that we had rather intensely last year.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about this. Well, it's been coming up again and again in different ways over recent weeks. But so much of what many of us are really upset about in the Christian faith is that we were given a version of Christianity from our parents and pastors and priests and Sunday school teachers and nuns and so on that was idealized. And very few of us, if any of us really, were given much about the actual history of our faith. And I think something that many of us didn't realize when September 11th, 2001 happened is that, we have 1400 years of history as a Christian faith with Islam. And we Christians have been, we've afforded ourselves the privilege of forgetting a lot of it. But there are a lot of people who can't forget it because it's still causing them trouble, and they still feel the wounds of it. And and so I think September 11th reminds us that our religion has dimensions of it that I'm 66 years old. I feel like I'm still just beginning to see some of the dimensions of it that have been there all along, but I was never taught, and it's taken a lifetime to start to see some of those dimensions of it that have to do with our history. The fact that for two white Christian straight guys in the United States, Tripp, you and I, we inherited a version of Christian faith that had incredibly ugly skeletons in its closet that nobody told us about, and we either had to find out on our own or other people made us aware of it. And so all of that, I think, comes bubbling to the surface. It's so interesting. We all remember, those of us who are alive, September 11th, 2001. And there's more and more people, who that's long before they were born now. But that question, why do they hate us? Why do they hate us? And the lack of depth of investigation to that question is really staggering and sad. And to think how few people have ever had any serious thought about that, even in these 21 years since, um, is disturbing. And uh, and what tended to happen is, why do they hate us? The answer was they're insane, or there's something wrong with them, or they have a bad way of life and they don't appreciate our good way of life. And that just sort of multiplies the misunderstanding. So this is a good day to be having talking about part one.
Yeah. And one of the threads that runs through a lot of the reasons to say no and resonates with our rather ugly responses as a church, at least in the West, those that were part of the NATO actions, following 9/11, is violence. And there are so many different questions around violence that I think it might be helpful for you to share, like, how has Brian, as a person of faith, wrestled with the question of violence and what it means, what kind of challenges it give to your own struggle with Christian identity or with discipleship and being faithful to Christ.
Yeah. One of the really pivotal days in my own upbringing that I very seldom talk about. I don't really think I've written about it. I started writing about it, and that I think I didn't end up including that in the book. Is on the day of the Kent State massacre. It was May 4th. It was my birthday, and my dad always, not every single day, but my dad was a committed, evangelical Christian. And two things you could count on is that after dinner, most days we would have a Bible reading around the table. And then second, we would have to go in and watch Walter Cronkite. And my dad was very big on making sure that my brother and me were exposed. My brother and I were exposed to current events and what was going on in the news. So I remember on my birthday having to watch the coverage of Kent State. And I remember seeing this vicious side of people. I have these very clear memories of Walter Cronkite and all the other reporters are in Ohio and they're asking people what they think. And the typical answer was those dirty commie hippies deserve what they've got coming to them. And so here what was I, 12 years old? No, 14 years old. And I'm realizing there are mean people in my country who other people getting shot by the police, they don't care, or the National Guard, they don't care. And I remember just this realization, there are really mean people in my country. And if I can be more specific, there are a lot of mean white people in my country. And I think one of the things that began to happen to me is realizing there are a lot of mean white Christians in my country. And that's even before I began to learn about the history. I just saw it as a kid growing up in the 60s and early 70s in sort of in the hatred of the counterculture with which I identified, because the Vietnam War didn't make sense to me. The civil rights movement did make sense to me. And so that sense of seeing meanness, I think, was a big formative thing in my own life. But I think of people since September 11th who've watched especially conservative evangelicalism and conservative Catholicism get weaponized, first against Muslims, and that sort of vicious anti-Muslim thing that we saw in the years after. I mean, I'm sure that's a formative thing for a lot of folks who are part of this today. Just saying, what happened to this religion that it became acceptable to be so vicious and wish violence on people and be for bombing and torturing people. And then, of course, it's expanded to Mexicans and immigrants, and of course, gay people are the scapegoat du jour for an awful lot of people, and liberals and the coastal elites and all of this sort of thing. And so, yeah, I think what it starts looking to me like is, if this is a religion about getting mean people to heaven, and letting them feel morally superior, man, I can see why people don't want to be part of a religion like that. It just seems to be a really dangerous cocktail.
One of the questions around violence that came in is from Janine, and I was sitting there and thought, oh, I've thought this, and I don't think I would ever ask it because of what it implies. But she said that when it comes to the question of violence, I don't see how you could choose to stay Christian and stay committed, at least explicitly and implicitly, in the way you engage in structures to violence. It seems that being nonviolent is a prerequisite for being a disciple of Jesus, and yet so many of the people who are Christians today don't even consider the call to nonviolence. Is it okay if going forward I just call myself a Christian, a failing nonviolent Christian, and the other one's just something heretical or horrible or wrong or a waste of time? I feel guilty putting it this way. I was like, I know the vibe. It's like, I'm not promising I'm perfect. I'm just saying, if you're going to tell the gospel, it shouldn't ultimately go this way. Yes. I was like, I resonate with Janine.
And Janine, I should say, we really should bring that question back in the next when we talk about part 2, because and when we talk about part 3 as well, because the issue of how we position our identity, if we're going to stay Christian, in relation to the people who identify as Christian but also are violent and white supremacist and chauvinist and whatever else, it really is a problem, because we can what I call it later in the book is the cult of innocence, that we could try to establish our innocence of the violence of other people. But in the effort to establish innocence, by separating ourselves from others, we could end up being part of some things we don't actually want to be part of. And so what I'm going to advocate as we go along is that we find ways to simultaneously distinguish ourselves from the violence and affirm our solidarity, and our shared humanity. Ultimately, this issue of violence is a deeply embedded problem in the Christian religion, especially the Christian religion over the vast majority of our history. Thankfully, not necessarily in the very early decades and centuries, and thankfully not in every single expression of Christianity, but it is really a dominant thing. But here's the problem. This violence is also endemic in every other culture and part of life. And so uh, I think what our struggle with this in the Christian faith maybe can help us do and own is feel the weight of the human history of violence and our human proclivity to violence. Maybe we could think of it like, you know, a lot of us, we live in a culture where we have access to so much fat and sugar that it's so easy for us to eat and make ourselves unhealthy by what we eat. I think we could also say we have a proclivity toward violence, and it's easy for us in the participating in the normal affairs of life to find violent disease rising up inside of us. So this is something that we should be bothered about. I don't want any of us to get comfortable with it, but I also think that the way we handle it is a test as well, if I could say it like that.
Brian, I just sent you the next question. I have a kid screaming. I'll be right back. We'll see
Okay,
what's
fantastic. Great. This is reality. That's good. The next question is: staying Christian different than staying atheist? And I really like that question because I think it invites us to look at something on two sides. Let's look at that word theist for a minute. So, at your first thought, you might see theist and you say, oh, that means believe in God, as opposed to an atheist as a person who doesn't believe in God. But I wish it were that simple, because when you say the word theist and you say believing in God, you have to say, what are our basic assumptions about that definition of God? I know a lot of Christians who've decided that the traditional theistic definitions, the traditional conventional definitions of God, are so much part of the problem that they don't want to call themselves theists, because, for example, some of those ideas of violence are implicit in the definitions of an almighty God. And for many people, almightiness is one of the necessary uh, descriptors of that always goes along with the word God. So I think I think what we have to say is there are some people who are going to stay Christian without staying traditionally theist. And if that comes as a shock for some people, just live with it for a minute, and we can explore that more. I think there are other people who are going to say, I'm going to remain theist, but I'd rather not keep the Christian label. And I think it's probably a good start for us to just all be able to say, let's understand why people would make those distinctions before we feel we have to jump on one boat or the other, one side or the other, that we say, yeah, uh, people are doing these things usually for good reasons. And before you judge them or argue with them, it's always, in my experience, a good idea to find out, why is this a necessary move? Why is this a necessary step? I think another dimension of this that adds complexity, but also maybe might help more of us understand what we're struggling with. In one of the chapters in part one about constricted intellectualism, and in the chapter about stuck or toxic theology, I try to bring up some of these hidden assumptions underneath Christian theology, and we might even say the word theism. For example, the idea that there is this eternal category of spirit, and then this temporal category of matter, energy, time, and so on. And for some people, their definitions of God are stuck within that two-tiered universe. And now that two-tiered universe makes no sense to them anymore. They can't work with it and live within it anymore. And they may think that means they have to now throw out any idea of God. And one of the, I think, opportunities of this moment is that I can promise people this. It's out there. If you listen to Homebrewed Christianity, you hear some of the best thinkers in this space alive today. But there are people who are rethinking the notion of God outside of those old categories of eternal and temporal or natural and supernatural and so on. So and almighty and contingent, all of those old dualisms are being challenged. And so that's what opens up these questions. I hope that makes some sense there, and I hope everything's okay at the house there.
Well, when you have 3 kids in different ages, all sorts of things come up.
Yes.
And if multiple bathrooms are being used, sometimes 2 sets of parent hands are required. That's the PG version. So the next question is from Bill. It's on. He's discussing chapters 7 and 8, but he sent in the audio, which for everyone in the class, if you send in the question in the audio, it gets preferential treatment because then someone else is talking other than us two. And you can always get more of a question when you hear the tone. So see if. Oh, I got to turn it up.
Christian.
There we go.
And probably chapters 7 and 8 on toxic theology and lack of transformation. I live in the politically conservative, Republican, Southern U.S. and continue to be puzzled by the choice of probably 70% of my fellow congregants who support Donald Trump and Republicans like Marjorie Taylor Greene. My friends will support local ministries serving those in need, but seem allergic to acknowledging the larger existential threats to society like global warming and real threats to our democratic institutions posed by Trump and Republican supporters. I currently work outside the church to try to bring about that transformation. The question I ask myself and Brian is, by remaining a member of a congregation and supporting it with my time and money, could I be enabling behaviors by Christians that stands in the way of radical transformation that is called for in today's church and society at large?
My goodness, that question is so well stated, isn't it, Tripp?
Yeah.
Before I take that on, anything you want to say about the question?
I would just say I understand it a lot more having spent 3 years in Scotland and coming back. I thought maybe you and Diana were exaggerating it last year during 9/11, and I don't think that's the case. In this question, I mean, I picked the audio version to hear his voice, but there were quite a few people who, and you mentioned this in the intro to the book, go like here's what the no section is. If you've had a positive experience in a congregation and practicing the institutional side of Christianity has been, helpful, like listen to it, because there are plenty of people that have these questions, and then let it go in. And I just think it's really invigorating and scary to hear people where the part 1 of the book, the no section, like hits hard. And then you go, I could be doing like the best I can, and then go, am I sustaining an institution that its output is ultimately a bigger problem than the blessings I've received and the ones I've given in it? And I think I know what it would feel like to ask that question, and it's just not comfortable. It just isn't. But if we don't take that seriously, then I fear especially in the West, the church is going to continue to be an institution used for such horrible means. But I mean, that doesn't settle any question about an individual, at the congregational level.
Yeah. Something I love about this question is, first, I love that this person cares, and I love that this person is investing his life and energy on issues of real and deep importance, like climate change and working against and protecting democracy, and working against further insurrections and voter suppression and so on. Thank God that for you, brother, who sent this question in, that you're invested in those things. Because one of the things that church involvement can do is suck people's energy so much into church activities that they don't have any time left to invest in some of these matters of existential threat. The second thing I love about the question is it allows us to make just an observation, which is sometimes your problem is your congregation or your denomination, not the entire religion of Christianity. And so it might help for many of us to say, I'm secure in my Christian identity in the way I understand what it means to be a follower of the way of Christ, or someone who walks the path of love and nonviolence, someone who works for justice and generosity and goodness and the common good. I'm secure in that Christian identity. My problem is I feel that by investing and supporting this congregation, I feel I'm supporting something else. And if people feel that discomfort, I would not try to reduce the discomfort. I would try to say that is a discomfort you should feel, and now let's figure out what to do about it. And here's my recommendation. And I say this, I was a pastor for 24 years. And I'll just tell this quick story. When I was a pastor, gay marriage wasn't yet legal anywhere. So, or at least I think all through the years in my state, it still wasn't legal. And we were on a journey of learning what it would mean to be fully supportive of all people, without stigmatizing LGBTQ people. But we had a lot of people at different places, and not everybody was there. And there was a fellow who had come to faith at our congregation. He was a guy with a PhD. He was brilliant. He was a aerospace engineer. And he and I were very close, and I played a big role in his own grappling with a lot of his questions that brought him on his spiritual search and his coming to faith. And suddenly he left the church and never came to see me, never told me why. And so I heard secondhand it was because he met a lot of people in the church who were homophobic. And what I remember wishing is I wish he would have come and told me that this was his concern and he was thinking he might need to leave, because I could have told him, listen, if you can possibly stay, I need you to stay, because I need people like you to help us turn the tide. And we're in the process of making progress in this. But so his leaving ended up setting back our progress. And I think it was just because he didn't know, and he didn't know that I would have really been happy to have him stay. And in fact, I would have been happy to have him stay and raise some trouble about it. And so what I would recommend people do is, if you're in that situation, you make an appointment with your pastor and people in leadership, and you tell them, look, I'm struggling, because it feels to me like our church is not taking a stand about things that are deeply important to me. And it's giving me second thoughts about whether I can stay. I love this church. I'd like to stay, but I'm really troubled. Can you help me? And don't come with an accusation. It's not you have a problem. It's I have a problem. My conscience is troubled, and I need to get this on the table. And I think sometimes the appropriate thing to say is, I need to know whether someone like me should stay and be vocal, or if my being vocal is just going to make you want to kick me out. Maybe I'm going to be vocal anyway, but if I'm not welcome here, with all of me speaking up about these things that concern me, then it's highly likely I need to find someplace else. But to me, to bring that into the community and let that be an issue that gets debated and discussed and talked about is part of the foment that brings about change. And let me just give another example. Um, uh, you know, People like Marjorie Taylor Greene advertise that they're members of congregations. And if I were a member of the same congregation she went to, I would be going to the leaders of my church and I would be saying, how is it that you never confront her on lies that she tells? How is it you've never seen it as part of her discipleship that she needs to learn how to love her neighbors a little bit better? And that her support of this and this and this seems inconsistent with Christian faith. I'm concerned about how someone with her power is using that power in such a harmful way, and no one here at the church seems to be doing anything about it. I think we have to be those kinds to recall the words of John Lewis, that's a good kind of troublemaking. And we need to trouble the waters in many more of our churches. I'll just say,
Mhm.
I don't want to, I try to not bring the church that I'm now a member of, into, into public light. But I've been so impressed with some members of my congregation who have just decided that they need to speak up about issues. And I'd say, 7 or 8 years ago, I felt like I was the only one who ever spoke up about some of these issues. And it's really been encouraging to me to see other people now raising their voices too. And so I think this is important.
Yeah. One of the things that struck me in bringing that up is the way in which um, uh, that kind of response is extreme. It's a wonderful gift to give a minister who wants to change
Yes.
and facilitate it. Yeah, it's like when Biden was vice president, and he let it slip out of his mouth on Meet the Press about same-sex
Yes.
marriage. And it's
Yeah.
like, well, okay, I guess we're going there now. And I would just say that kind of advice is not something to do when your own value, your own identity is being threatened or harmed. Right, like
Yes.
it is an more appropriate response for people to when they have privilege in a space to do
Yes.
than especially if you're comfortable being the punching bag
Yes.
during it. But when you think of it, the greatest gift you give leaders in organizations that are wanting to change, be it a family to a
Yes.
congregation, is for you to be able to state clearly your deepest convictions, to do
Yes.
it without being anxious and threatened by others, and then staying connected and insistent on your identity,
Yes.
because then it forces a community, be it from a family, a work organization, or a congregation, and these type of things, to adjust to the reality of you being honest, and
Yes.
don't take anyone's first response to the introduction of you stating the truth as you understand it as their
Yes.
final response, because
Yes.
none of us do our best at the first moment. And I just think that uh, thinking strategically, that was kind of the short summary of, if you are into family systems theory, how you
Yeah.
approach change. But I would just say, like, think about it. Uh, um, Systems exist in a relational dynamic. When you want it to grow in a healthy way, new possibilities have to be registered for it even to get a new homeostasis in a more
Yes.
beautiful place. And that
And
requires non-anxious declarations of value from
and
somebody.
and it always brings disequilibrium in the middle.
Mhm.
And one of the keys is for the people bringing about the change to not be naive about the disequilibrium, and to find a way. My little phrase that I always like to credit the brilliant African theologian Mabiala Kenzo for is that we have to have the courage to differ graciously, and that combination is what we really need. Can I just say, I noticed one of the comments was from someone who's Catholic, and for all the Protestants who are part of the class, I think it's important to remember that for many Catholics, religious identity it's a different animal than for Protestants. I noticed someone had said a very common realization. A lot of people are in a diocese where the bishop or maybe the archbishop above them, are working very hard to return the Catholic Church to pre-Vatican II Catholicism. And so to be part of that church, excuse me, to be part of that church is always done in a sense against the wind, because the wind is blowing toward the past. And because I'm not Catholic, but I love many Catholic people, and I've been deeply involved in many Catholic communities. I suppose I can say this, but if you're Catholic, you may not be able to get any satisfaction in your parish or in your diocese, but here's where you may need to find alliances that in the larger Catholic Church with sort of underground groups. And this applies to both Catholics and Protestants. I think there are times for what we might call ecclesial disobedience. Let me just give a quick example of this. Some of y'all remember, it's about a year or two ago, that the Council of Bishops were talking about not letting anyone take the Eucharist if they voted for Democrats, right, or something like that, or they were going to deny Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden the Eucharist. And I was in conversation with some of my Catholic friends, and we had located some priests who had said, okay, they don't care. They're older. They aren't in the hunt for position in the church anymore. They don't even care if they get excommunicated. I mean, I'm sure they care, but they're willing to risk that. And they said, if they do this, we will go online and we'll start celebrating the Mass for people who can then go to their parish and say, I'm not going to be giving money here anymore. I'm not going to be attending Mass here anymore. I'm maintaining my Catholic commitment through other channels. But I just need you to know I can't support what's going on here anymore. I think we're in times that are dangerous enough that kind of ecclesial disobedience is increasingly important. I even remember in my evangelical days, there were, churches would take strong stands against gay people or people who were unwed mothers, or there was all, even divorced people were stigmatized. And there were people who would say, we're going to have a fellowship dinner every Sunday night at my house and everyone's welcome, including the people who are being excluded from what happens here on Sunday mornings. We're going to do something in our home where you're accepted and welcomed and treated with dignity and respect. To me, that's all the kind of creative work that can help us find ways of staying Christian in an even more beautiful way, made even more beautiful by the ugly behavior of some other people.
Yeah. Well, Brian, do you need some water? Do you keep
I'm
coffee?
going to run and grab some water.
All right, good. Because I don't want to quit early just because you needed water, Brian. So for those of you that joined late, Brian has is dealing with the end of COVID, so getting water perfectly. I came prepared, the jug of water, but one of there are a host of questions that follow this format. And especially the first half of part one, Brian, you explore so many different areas and you kind of prove the point of how we treat our mother and how we treat each other and how we treat the heretic and the outcast and these things by digging into points of history where you go, oh, wow, that happened, and there were a number of emails that shared a question. What happened the first time you learn these things? And how is it that you respond when you're getting these new knowledge? Take, for example, the doctrine of discovery. That was the most popular, in scare quotes, element from the first part of the book that came up as to how do we deal with the doctrine of discovery? How do we take it seriously? do you have advice on that? Because it maybe begin by saying what the doctrine of discovery is, and tell us your own, like when you learned it, and then what you did with it, and then taking it seriously enough to go like, this is a good reason to say no.
Well, maybe I can. Some of you will remember near the beginning of the book, I gave a little parable. I call it the parable of the 14-year-old in a mafia family. And, you could imagine a kid growing up in a family that is super loving, prosperous, great vacations, unusually close. And then you find out that your family's part of something called the mafia, and the closeness and the prosperity and all the rest now that have enriched your whole childhood, you realize there's this ugly side to it. And now you're faced with a decision. If you go into the family business, you have one future. If you refuse to, you have another future. And that's very much, I think, how I felt. And I would hear stories, but one of the things Protestants tend to do is we say, "Oh, Catholics did that," or we'll find some other liberals did that. And the way the conservatives always told the story, conservatives were always lily pure, and so for me, I'd hear things and it would be just put away as that was a bad apple. They were men of their time. But here's what the day it hit me. I was giving a talk, and it was back in the late 90s. And I was beginning to grapple with this term postmodern. And I remember I'd started to think that, and my main approach to postmodern was philosophical. But then I started to realize that if we say that modernity begins around 1500 is not very far away from 1492. And then I realized that modernity is also the era of the conquistadors. And what we call colonialism is really the era of the conquistadors. And when I realized, I was in the middle of giving a talk, and it dawned on me. And I remember thinking as I was giving the talk, oh man, I've got to go back and rethink everything. Because if what the conquistadors were about was conquering the world in Jesus' name and for the power of the church, and of course I knew the conquistadors in Latin America were doing it for the Catholic Church, but I knew the colonizers and the colonists in North America were doing it for Protestant churches. And then I realized, oh my gosh, this whole thing is Christianity is tainted with all of this violence. I didn't even know about the doctrine of discovery, but that's what I was sort of intuitively tapping into. I was first exposed. I came across the term in different places, but the first person who really, I thought, compellingly introduced me to the doctrine of discovery was Mark Charles, a Navajo author who has a wonderful book. If you want to really be educated on the doctrine of discovery, I'd encourage you to read the book he co-authored with Soong-Chan Rah called Unsettling Truths. But basically what happened was in the 1400s, and Tripp, I hope it's okay for me to give a little history here because this might be helpful.
Oh, yeah.
This is something I didn't give in the book. But in the 1400s, Europe had a Muslim incursion happening, and they were coming from the southeast, and they were moving to the northwest, and the Pope was very worried about this, and the Pope needed more money to raise more armies to fight off the invading Muslims or the encroaching Muslims. And so he comes up with a strategy to get more money and to advance the cause of this Christian versus Muslim struggle. So he tells the king of Portugal, who's got ships that are exploring around Africa and so on, that that the Pope gives him permission to invade and search out all lands that are owned by Saracens. That was their word for Muslims and other heathens who are now all together called enemies of Christ. And here's the term that is chilling, and to subject their persons to perpetual slavery. So what the Pope did is gave permission to the King of Portugal to subject people to perpetual slavery. He was creating a slave empire in the name of Christ, a Christian slave empire. Also gave him permission to steal all their wealth and all the rest. And of course, knowing that the Pope and the church would get a kickback from all of this. And later that permission was granted to the Spanish, and then it was granted to the French. And of course, in some ways, this helps explain Protestant colonialism too, because when the Protestant Reformation happens, and remember, from 1492 to 1518 is not very long either. And when these the Protestants break away, in a sense, they can go on their colonizing spree, and now they don't have to share any of the profits with the Pope. And so this explains so much of the last 500 years of history. And 100% of Catholic and Protestant theology has been influenced by these 500 years of history. And I just think we would, well, let me say it this way. I was a fool for many years to not understand how that kind of politics would affect the Christian theology, but it has affected it. And we're having to face this. We're having to face this now. And that's one of the things that, if you're feeling like, I don't want to stay Christian, something's wrong with this religion, that's a big part of what's wrong. And you have a right instinct. And and that's one of the things I think that we're all trying to come to terms with.
Mm-hmm. One of the members in the group, Barbara, is working on her doctorate right now and is looking at awareness of these kind of atrocities. And she messaged me asking and saying how many people in the group knew about the doctrine of discovery and the way it shaped Christianity prior to reading it. So I think that's a good question. So if you're in the group, if people already were familiar with it before reading it, then share in the group where you heard about it, and if it was introduced in ways that were compelling to think through the colonialist legacy of the church. Because I think the more we know the parts of our history we've muted, silenced, and repressed, the more we can actually tend to the way the energies of those perverted expressions of the faith show up in our own life. But as long as they're silenced and ignored, then you don't know all that you're inheriting. And because you mentioned post-colonial, the post-colonial connection to post-modernity, Brian, I popped in my head whenever I teach philosophy of religion, there's always 2 weeks on post-colonial philosophy of religion. And one of the concepts I spend a lot of time on, and this is usually graduate students, is worlding. And I think it's so helpful to get, and I think it helps even people that aren't even thinking about post-colonialism get it, because it's dealing in the context of India, that the conquerors, right, the British conquerors come in, and then they meet the native Indians, and then they need to make a map. And what do? They find the ones in the native Indians who knows the world around them best, their land, and they get them to tour it and everything. And by the time they get done, they've transferred all the wisdom that they've received and then put it on a map and given it colonialist names and markings and boundaries. And then that's what's printed and handed out to everyone. And in a couple generations, the very same families know a different world because it was reworlded, right?
Yes.
And I think that as we understand the history of colonialism, we find out that so much of the colonialist legacy, we've reworlded, like we've done this maneuver to the story of Jesus. We've done this to the teachings of Jesus. We've done it to even figures in our own history, like every MLK Day. You're sitting there going, the Baptist preacher who advocated nonviolence was against the war and was executed or murdered when taking a critique of capitalism, advocating universal basic income and all these kinds of things. And then you get people that wouldn't certify an election because too many black people voted in their state being like, well, I love Martin Luther King. Right. So these stories, I think, are so helpful. And so we ask one of the gifts of being honest, I think, by so much of the history that's in here is it helps us realize what ways have our history and our text been reworlded where it's not the kingdom of God. But, there's a whole nother agenda that's up to it.
Yeah. Yeah, well said. And of course, by the way, for folks, we're having this conversation in, a few days after Queen Elizabeth's death. And but if you haven't heard this already, I'm sure you will, that there are an awful lot of people who are saying, yeah, during the 70 years of that Queen Elizabeth was monarch, her relationship with that colonial history is not innocent, and so you'll be seeing some people feel nothing but remorse over a very nice grandmotherly lady who provided some stability for a whole period of people's entire lives, but for other people she'll represent this unacknowledged polite white European blindness to what happened. By the way, there are just so many books, and what happened, if people are interested in my own grappling with this, I just read and Chinua Achebe's incredible novel, Things Fall Apart. You can't read that and ever see things the same way again. Barbara Kingsolver's Poisonwood Bible. These are fiction, but they, in a sense, are helping you see into a period of history. And then nonfiction. I remember when I read King Leopold's Ghost, the story of the Belgian control of the Congo and the genocide that happened there. And then toward the end of the book, the author talks about, just in passing, the death toll in Nigeria under the British. And of course, I've spent time in Africa where, you then hear all the local stories of what happened in Rwanda and Burundi and Tanzania and Kenya and Uganda. And oh my goodness, it's just like this wave after wave of, why didn't anybody tell me this? When I studied history, why was all of this sanitized? And then of course you say, well, then here's what you say. Why didn't committed Christians stand up against this by the millions? They did by the tens, and they did by the 20s, and maybe by the hundreds, but not by the millions. And this is it's all out there, and there's just we could just deal in the United States or Canada with what happened with the native peoples here, and the role of the Christian religion with the native peoples. And maybe I'll just say one last thing. This has made me really suspicious about so many profoundly meaningful things about the Christian faith. One of them being that the word forgiveness. When forgiveness is seen as this great product of the Christian faith, but then I think, how do I feel about white Christians showing up through the 250 plus years of slavery, then followed by segregation, apartheid, lynching? How do I feel about white Christians showing up Sunday after Sunday, supporting those systems and being pronounced forgiven, and praising Jesus for forgiving them, and never having any significant function of the Christian faith to make them face the cruelty and vicious subhuman behavior that they were engaging in? It makes that word forgiveness not roll off the tongue quite so easily.
Yeah. You mentioned the Queen's passing, and there were a number of people that sent in messages and they kind of fall into two very different responses, right? Those that were moved by it usually comes from people that are familiar with people from the UK, but those that are moved by her character and care and what she did in that position, the kind of ways it brings so many different people together in that space, and that kind of thing. And then the kind of this is the queen that was in charge of a colonialist empire, right? Like, why are so many Christians getting worked in? Why are all the churches in the country organized in ways that celebrate this, kind of thing? And as a Baptist, I definitely lean towards the second, but that's not surprising. I was lectured about this for 3 years in Scotland when people got real worked up about royalty. But one person sent in this, and I couldn't find the email, but so I'll try to give the example. They said, I've seen both responses in the group and among friends, and I wonder if what kind of more white progressive people see when they see the Queen is someone who recognized more and more over time they inherited something that was problematic and ugly, and has sought graciously, while still preserving the system, to address it. And others see that exact same person and go, yeah, you should know better, so why aren't you really addressing it? And I think I wonder what you thought, because we had that conversation a year ago when all the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast was going on, about the way evangelicals in many ways are wrestling with their community's allegiance to Trump by wrestling with their response to the story of Mark Driscoll and such. And this message made me think if that's not something similar. Like, in some ways, we're reflecting on how we see the generations older than us and how they wrestled with what they inherited or not. And if we can see something redemptive in her, then maybe we could see it in ourselves, our parents, our grandparents that are dealing with it. Well, at the same time, you want to go, come on, you were in charge of an empire.
Yeah. And there's, again, this is one of the dangerous things that I think we'll talk about more next time. But this desire to separate myself from anything that seems bad and that's tainted, so that I will have a kind of pristine innocence. And so then I just want to say, yeah, the Queen, she's horrible, and England is terrible, and the United States is terrible, and Christianity is terrible. And the problem is, eventually you say, what about the human race? And then you have to say, yeah, the human race is kind of terrible too. Well, then you say, well, hold it, not the whole thing. And I think this is one of our challenges. Later in the book, in fact, it's the beginning of part 3 in the book. I talk about stage theory as a way to help people understand, and said maybe we should come back to this in a couple of weeks to talk about stage theory. But if I could just give a preview of that, many of us are at a dualistic stage where our whole moral capacity is basically, we have the ability to sort things into categories: us, them, good, bad, friend, enemy, loyal, disloyal, advantageous, disadvantageous, and everything is pretty binary for us. And that's where we are. We haven't learned any sophistication beyond that. That's the only thing we know how to do. And here's the thing that I think it might help us to see. You can be a dualistic conservative, and you can be a dualistic progressive. I might think you're more right more of the time as a dualistic progressive, but here's the problem: that if your only toolbox is us who we praise and them who we condemn, us who we approve of, them who we judge and cancel, if that's our only tool in the toolbox, we're going to find out that we aren't as innocent as we thought, because we'll end up creating some of our own moral shame. Just give us time, because that's what dualistic humans do. And the sad thing about being a dualistic human who's shaming and condemning other people is that we are so convinced of our own innocence that then we're the last to see when now we're causing harm too.
Mm-hmm. The next question is was sent in the Facebook group while we were talking, and this is in relationship to reason number 8, the lack of transformation.
Yes.
The reason for all the others. I'm torn between responding to this chapter by thinking that the gate is truly narrow, radical transformation, etc., like St. Francis. But how does this square with the call? Oh, I have to take it off to see the rest of it. The call of grace to come as we are, which inevitably means we accept and welcome, while hoping for transformation, people who are greedy, consumeristic, racist, violent, patriarchal, etc.
Yeah, I think this is one of the things that if the Christian faith has a future, and that depends on how millions of us answer this question of whether we stay Christian and how we're going to stay Christian. If it has a good future, it's going to require us to become realistic about transformation. And it's going to require us to think longer term and to be able to think about doing multiple things at once. This is again why stage theory seems helpful to me. If we can say we've got to help the children develop basic dualistic skills, but we have to then help them when they become teenagers to develop the skills of complexity, of pragmatism and of critical thinking. And then as they age, we have to help them develop even deeper skills of critical thinking and relativistic thinking and historical analysis and so on. We have to help them learn to tell the story of things and see deeply in things. And then we have to help them even develop what we might call mystical or transcendent kind of overarching, holistic, integral capacities. What that means is transformation is not a one-shot deal. It's a lifelong process of growth. And I like to think that there are times, especially for our Catholic folks on the call or in the class, where we could look at Catholicism that had this idea that there were certain people who go and live in monasteries and they're way, way ahead of all the rest of us. And then there are other people who might not go that far, but they do this. And there are other people, but we have this idea that there are people who are way, way ahead of us, and which has a certain humbling attitude effect on us, and also lets us know that there's more and more territory for us to discover. In Protestantism, because we developed either a one-stage or a two-stage salvation process, you were either saved or unsaved, or you were saved and spirit-filled. You speak in tongues now, but both of these involved now you've arrived. And in a certain sense, once you've arrived, then you just spend the rest of your life imposing your current thinking on other people. And this explains an awful lot, I think, of what's going on in our world. And I think we need to recover this sense that of what it means to be a follower of Christ is a lifelong journey into deeper and deeper depths and higher and higher heights and broader breadths. And that this gives us a perpetual beginner's mind, I think, and a sense of very fertile, curious humility.
Yeah. Well, now, how are you doing energy-wise with your COVID recovery? I'm trying to gauge my number of questions. You want?
No, let's keep going. Let's keep going.
All right. If you need a refill for water, just let me know. Now, this is a let's see. Let's do Ted's. Ted asked on a topic that was popular, and he gives a specific reference because he was looking at chapter 9. He said, I had a continuing snowball of overwhelming grief reading through part 1. And when I got to chapter 9, I had this question that stuck with me. Do you, Brian, think clergy are most responsible by avoiding the intellectual pursuit of truth and Christian theology to instead produce feel-good sermons to help people with a complex world? If it is simply a cultural battle, how much of the fault lies with clergy? P.S. I'm one of them. And Brian, also, thanks for the rolling tire pun in the book, which for those of you that read it will get it. But there were a number of ministers who ask these kinds of questions, like
Yeah.
when looking at the inside business of religion, how much of it is the leaders not giving, not even telling the truth as they've come to understand it, so that the congregation gets a chance to respond, but always being strategic, slow playing, and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Tripp, here's the thing. Like if I imagine, and I don't know this for sure, but this is my sense, and someone in this class may know more about this than I do and could correct me. But if we were to go back to 1840, I don't think there were seminaries that were teaching white Christian seminarians that Black people and indigenous people and Asian people who are beginning to immigrate in greater numbers, and people of Hispanic descent. I don't think there were seminaries saying these are our equals, and it's our Christian job to get rid of this white supremacy that we inherited, and now have a revolution of the kind of revolution that Paul wrote about in Galatians when he said, in Christ there's neither male or female, Jew or Greek, slave nor free. I don't think it's that seminaries were teaching this and then the clergy were afraid to try to teach it to their congregations. There were a few seminaries that were trying to say this sort of thing. Quakers were at the forefront of this, among others. But I think the seminaries weren't teaching it either. I think it was all part of this one. The church had basically become the chaplain to an economic system, a culture that was driven by an economic system. And this, to me, is one of our great opportunities going forward. And that is that I think what we have to realize at the end of the day is that that the same money that ruled in this period of slavery in American history, and in the period of the slaughter and displacement of the native peoples, it's the same economy that's ruling today. And one of the problems is that the Christian religion operates on an economic model that depends on donor dollars keeping the thing going. And when the donor dollars come from a whole set of assumptions that requires the exploitation of human beings, exploitation of labor, exploitation of the planet, and if people start preaching against that, then the donors stop funding it. And I think one of the things that's going to happen going forward is we're going to have to become way more savvy about the power of money. And we're going to have to come up with models of funding this thing, and structuring it and funding it, that will render us less susceptible so that we can have a truly revolutionary message. And a difference that I think has happened in the last 40 or 50 years, really since the 60s, is that I think seminaries have been doing a better job of teaching clergy about the equality of women and the wrongness of male domination. And they're teaching about racism much more than many seminaries are than they used to. And they're teaching about LGBT equality and things that just weren't taught before. And so I think part of the reason why we're having this conversation is that more and more clergy have been having more and more courage to speak out in recent decades. And we might think we're at the end of a change process. What if we're just 20% into a change process, and it's the kind of outrage that many of us feel? Maybe part of our outrage is what helps promote this, keeps this ball rolling. And it's why, Tripp, I'm such a fan of the work you do with Homebrewed, and it's why I write books, and it's why discussions like this are important, because we're actually helping make certain futures possible by what we cultivate through conversations like this.
Mm-hmm. It is a difficult thing, I think, just in reading all the questions that people sent in and the stories attached to them. It's just a difficult thing to think of the volume of pain that the church has caused to people.
Yeah.
And there are so many stories people brought in, and I wasn't sure from how they sent it exactly how to share it, but I edited one so that there's nothing following the rules you gave at the beginning of your of the book on how you tell stories. So this is the part I'm not reading is a description of a family member who was in a traditional male-female Christian relationship, though one of the partners in that relationship had always understood themselves as gay, and eventually leaves family and 3 kids, marries their gay partner, and the family's wrestling with it. And that's where they pick up a quote from you in chapter 8. I thought of your statement at the end of chapter 8, where you said, quote, "Think of the impact of conventional Christian theology on Christian women and gay people and the poor. If you persist in minimizing these failures of the past and brushing them aside as trivial matters, then please realize, to growing millions of people, you now represent the contemporary failure of Christianity to transform lives. To put it more bluntly, if you are a living example of the failure, you are a living example of the failure of Christianity. You're another reason for them not to stay Christian." End quote. I totally agree with this, and my wife and I have transformed our theology and way of thinking to the side of inclusion and love. However, our family members, whom we love dearly as well, have not, and it's causing a rift and fear to relate and talk about our changes in thinking due to how closed off and turned off they are. Any advice on how to love both gay people that are in our family and also those who won't accept them in our family through this? Not an easy answer, I know, but this is our struggle, and it's real.
Yeah. So when we get to chapter 26 in the third part of this, we'll really focus on that question. Let me, so maybe what I'd recommend is someone might want to jump ahead and read that chapter. But I think what we're going to have happen is millions of us, because there are millions of us out there, millions of us are going to have to speak up, and we're going to have to do it in ways that are disturbing to people, but yet are surprising in their graciousness and in their harmlessness, meaning we're not trying to hurt anyone, we're not trying to insult or punish anyone, but we're also not willing to let bigotry and harm go unchallenged. And one of the most powerful ways I think we can do this, if I could offer people a script, it would be, "That breaks my heart." So you hear your mother says something insulting about a gay member of your family, and you just say, "Mom, it breaks my heart when you talk like that." And you don't have to say anything more. You register your pain, and you decide that you're going to not be quiet and just swallow it. You're going to let people know that what you have just experienced, you experience as harm. And I one of my favorite phrases for this is, "Wow, I see that differently." And just to register, I see that differently, and to continue to differ. And then I think there are times when we need to draw lines, and we might need to say, for example, Mom and Dad, if we show up for Thanksgiving dinner and you have Fox News and OAN playing all the time, and my kids are exposed to you saying insulting things about the president and calling people like us libtards and so on, I'm sorry, but we'll be leaving as soon as we hear that sort of thing. We'd really like to be there for the whole time, but we will leave if we feel you're insulting us and you're putting a bad influence on our children. Just want you to know that. It doesn't have to be done in a hateful way, but I think we have to start putting up some limits. It's one of the ways authoritarianism it spreads. It's one of the ways fascism spreads is by dominating the airspace. Steve Bannon's term for it is that, they want to flood the space with bullshit. And if people let the space continue to be flooded with unchallenged BS, then we get the kind of world that we have now. And so this is where more of us just have to say, I'm sorry, I'm not going to put up with that anymore. I won't be staying if that's the way you want to conduct things,
Yeah. Well, the okay, this is an intense one, and there's not a I don't know what how much of the preface statement is shareable, but I think the question's good. This individual, the couple, a couple, they've been married 16 years, have 2 kids. They're reading it together, and they said they don't know if they should say thank you, but one of the partners knows their answer is no, and the other one's yes. How do we love each other and honor being in different spaces and being in a family?
Well, let me say, if you can keep coming back for the coming weeks, here's one of the things that's a little clearer to me now than even when I finished writing the book. I wish if I could add a sentence, it would be something like this. At the end of the book, some of you who've already read to the end know, I'll say, look, some of you are going to say yes, and then some of you are going to say no. But my real hope is that everyone will in some ways say yes and in some ways say no. In other words, that we'll find a way for all of us will find a way to hold a yes and no together. If I could say it like this, it's yes, I want the love that Jesus talks about. Yes, I want the peace that Jesus talks about. Yes, I want the commitment to character and integrity and maturity. Yes, I want all of that. But no, I do not want this and this and this. And to be able to have that yes and that no, and hold them simultaneously. Look, that's what we do about just about everything in our life sooner or later. We say yes to our job, but there's some things we say no to. We say yes in our marriage, but there are some things we say no to. And this is part of what it means to be a mature adult human, I think. And so maybe what we can, a couple who feels they're at different places in this, each one can say, let me help you with a part that's easy for me now, or that feels natural for me now. And you help me with a part that doesn't feel so natural for me now. And we might help each other be at a better balance there.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that comes to mind is you should celebrate having a beautiful enough relationship. You both were honest and took each other where they are seriously.
Yes.
Because I know plenty of people who have answers for questions they don't know if they get to share them with the person they're closest to. And wherever anyone ends up at any point in time, I think a relationship that honest is something worth celebrating, and something that you shouldn't be scared of, sharing with kids when they get, are at the right age and that kind of thing. Because honest answers to religious questions have to be one of the things people keep silent on the most. So yeah, let's see. Let's do Michael's question. Okay. This is Michael asks a question about, and this is pages 56 to 59. He has a few quotes in it. But he said, I love the image of a seam in the water that you use on pages 56 and 57 as a powerful example of the ever-changing eventness of the world. On page 57, Brian writes, I used to think that things were real and change was something that happened to them over time. Now I think that change is real and things are events that happen over time. Change is the constant and things come and go, appear and disappear, form and fade away. end quote. My experience has been that many Christians are deeply resistant to any change, let alone significant changes that would, quoting you from 59, would let us cut the old anchor line and start sailing again, end quote. What are some best practices to help people become more comfortable with deep transformational change for the church?
Wow, what a good question. And first, I'm glad that that person brought up that passage, because it's one of the passages that I felt really good about in the book, because I do think it's one of the issues that is making many people feel increasingly uncomfortable in the zone of Christian theology that is still based on those old dualisms of eternal, temporal, supernatural, natural, and that sort of thing. So I think one of the things that maybe we need to do is to the degree that we have been deeply, deeply immersed in theology and political rhetoric that works out of that sort of traditional set of categories. I think we need to spend more time outside. And I think we, that passage I talk about standing in a stream and observing the flow of water. Well, there's something about observing nature, letting nature, and in some way, this takes time and it takes practice. It's a kind of meditative state, really, but it's learning to be able to observe the natural world without our narration intact. Because what can easily happen is we observe the natural world, and the words that we use to narrate what we're seeing are more real to us than what we're actually observing. We walk along and we say, oh, oak tree, maple tree, weed, lawn, and we name everything, and we think in that way we've dispensed of it. But there's something about deep observation of the natural world. I think you feel it in a passage in the Gospels, like when Jesus says, look at the wind blowing through the trees. The Spirit is like that. You don't know where it comes from. You don't know where it goes, but you can kind of see what it's doing. So he uses this natural image. Or another place he says to them, you look at the sky and you say, if it's a red sky at night, good weather's coming, and you can tell the weather, but you don't pay attention to what's happening in the world around you. And Jesus had that kind of keen observation of the natural world and its flow and its interdependence. I don't think there's any way. I don't see any way through this without more of us doing that. Now, I suppose a secondary way that we get it is by reading different kinds of literature than the old argumentative theological literature that was always arguing about whose categories were right. So, for example, you might spend more time reading poetry. And if you give yourself a big dose of Mary Oliver and Wendell Berry and Rumi and Hafiz, you'll be at least exposed to language that doesn't reinforce all of those old dueling dualisms, if I can say it that way.
One of the things that that I've found helpful, especially in a leadership context, which I think Michael was wondering, like when it goes to big picture, is one of the difficult things in congregational leadership is a desire for nostalgia and celebrating the past.
Yeah.
And one of the things in helping to generate an awareness and openness to change is changing the way you narrate the past. So when you celebrate the past, there's a number of things you can emphasize and tell, so that the thing you're celebrating is the fidelity to the flow of the divine, rather than the arrival that we're now preserving. So if you celebrate past changes, you can name the challenge they're addressing. Then you can celebrate the cost that the community had to struggle with in thinking through the change, and then the conclusion. And if you name how there was a challenge and there was a cost, and then they got to this new place, and when we look back to the past, what does it mean to be faithful? It means for us to name the challenges in our present, to look at the cost and whether we can struggle to be faithful with it, and then to come to live into new conclusions. Like how you narrate the past changes it, and you can always just start with Acts. Like there are so many of us that are part of the body of Christ that aren't snipped religiously, and I think it was great for missions to not prescribe that. But underneath it really meant the Holy Spirit and Paul won an argument against Jesus's actual disciples who quoted the Bible correctly. Right? Like the fact that Gentiles are in is because there was a challenge. The life of the Spirit is going wild and crazy awesome in the middle of the church, and they aren't snipped. They aren't converting to Judaism, but the presence of the Spirit of Christ is there. So you name the challenge. What did it cost? Well, it cost a lot of friendships. It cost a breakup with Jesus's own freaking disciples. He got talked down by James, his brother. They all are complaining about it. Anyway, and then what was the conclusion? That we trust the presence of the Spirit of Christ to lead us into what the risen body of Christ looks like in the life of the church, rather than Jesus' actual disciples Bible thumping about ethical prescription. So and then if you know your denomination or your congregation, you can then tell stories. And if you emphasize that what it means to be faithful is to be faithful to the costly challenges in the present, in joining the life and flow of the Spirit, then that activity of nostalgia becomes like the battery for fidelity in the present. And because then you go, then where are we now? What time is it in our world? And that kind of stuff. But yeah, because it's much easier to rework nostalgia for your own ends than to tell everyone, who cares? It reminds me of that passage in Religion in the Modern World. Alfred North Whitehead is talking about the brilliance of religion to animate and move people and all these kinds of things. And then he goes, I just find it a bit odd. Einstein overthrows Newton, and no one goes to Einstein and says, look, we had high quality Isaac Newton material here when it goes to physics, Einstein. Like, why are you overthrowing him? No one goes, you're being a bad scientist. They're going like, no, you're a good scientist. You know what? And at the eschatological banquet, Newton's going to be like, well played, Einstein. Come on, Al, good material. Because that's what it means to be in search for truth. And he goes, why? When religions are calling us to deeper beauty in our souls and our community making, do we not also take change as a gift and an opportunity to inherit the past better? And it was that emphasis that we inherit better when we get closer to truth. And for religion, for Whitehead, we get more beautiful when we inherit it that way. So are we more beautiful when our congregations celebrate the gift of the Eucharist with every bodied and differently bodied person? I think a lot of us say yes, and that is a change. But is it being faithful? Yes. So like that using the Newton-Einstein thing, I thought was helpful, because everyone goes, oh, that was just good science. You're like, well, yeah, well, what if good discipleship is we just realize we got to go to colonialist detox? Yes. It's kind of like, maybe Jesus wasn't for his followers being professional cross builders. And
yes. And that maybe also helps all of us who are in this struggle to feel that our struggle is not something wrong with us. It's, in fact, you might say our struggle is the Christian faith trying to grow out of its colonialist, patriarchal, theo-capitalist distortion. You might even use language. It's us, in a sense, trying to rise out of a tomb and break out of grave clothes that we inherited.
Watch out, Brian. You're going to start preaching, and it's Sunday night. So, all right. I'm going to put two questions together for our last one because they're deeply related, and I think there are plenty of others that really connected with it. One question, Angela said, in the conversation we recorded on part 1, you said the worst days of the church could be ahead, ? Exclamation point, exclamation point. And there were a number of people brought that up, and then there were other questions related to it that said the worst days ahead is this connected to the growing tribalism and the way religion is now downstream from politics and economics. And I'd love for Brian's wisdom on how we be kind of salves in the midst of worst days ahead. How does it change the way you would lead your family, your life, your congregation, if you were wanting to be something good in the worst days? And Angela's in a question point I thought was I know the feeling, because I remember recording it and going, well, that's an interesting way to finish this first video.
Well, so let me just reiterate. I think it's almost certain that these ugly forms of Christianity that we see gaining steam here in the United States, and there's parallel versions of them in Brazil and in Hungary and in Russia, and Mexico and many other places. They're not going away. Whoever wins the next couple of elections, they're not going away. These groups have a lot of fear that's going to increase. They have a lot of resentment that's going to increase, and they have huge amounts of money flowing to them. And one of the things that authoritarian leaders have found is that angry white Christians, and there are other versions of this in Africa, and there are other versions of it in other places, but in the West, ugly white Christians are an enormous resource for authoritarian leaders. So you better believe that they're going to be pandered to and rewarded and all the rest. And so what I think we have to say is, if you're going to stay Christian, you're going to stay Christian over the next couple of decades, when major forms of Christianity are going to become far uglier than they are now. They have not yet hit their bottom. They're not close to their bottom. The bottom that we see now is way worse than the bottom 5 years ago. And there's no reason to believe that the bottom 5 years from now will be way worse than the bottom that we have right now. So I just think we have to say, if some of us are going to represent an improving form of Christianity, it's going to happen simultaneously with other forms that are decomposing, rotting, becoming increasingly decadent, and now I can't remember. I don't know if that's just depressing. I understand why that would make someone say, but I think at the same time, it's just being realistic. It's saying things are going to get worse at the same time that they're getting better. And in fact, the getting worse is one of the things that's going to wake more of us up to make them get better. Look, a lot of us would not be having this conversation if things were at the level of mediocrity they were 10 years ago. It's the fact that things are getting worse that's waking more of us up. And we should expect that that will continue to happen. And to me, the exciting challenge then is, how do we help the people who are waking up to now start doing something more constructive together? How do we organize? How do we build momentum? And those are questions that we're all living with. I'm living with them every day.
Yeah. Now, I'm going to say a few boring things, Brian, and then I want to give you a chance to give a benediction of sorts for everyone going in to deal with part 2, and those in the group who, especially those that shared plenty of things in questions we couldn't read out loud. But everyone, if you're a part of the group, remember, you can reply to any email questions. There's also a link in the resource page where you can go access everything that's the 3 video summaries of the book, and the audios there. I'll put this video and the audio up tomorrow. If you aren't a part of the group yet and join, maybe you're in a group watching it and you want to get access to it, go to doistaychristian.com and you'll be able to join up. The other thing is, on the resource page, there's the link if you want to send in your question in audio. So you can always do that. If you're part of this group and you say later, like, I'd love to go through it with friends, use the videos that we made, and you can use those and then discuss it, or you can share these. These are obviously a lot longer. So the goal was for individuals to be able to go through the group, but also anyone that in it now or later that wants to use it in their small group, discussion group, to be able to access the video guides and everything. I just want to say thank you to everyone who's been a part of it, and especially those that shared so many of their stories. I've read them all, even if I haven't responded to them all. But hopefully we wove together enough of the different topics and things tonight that as a collective, everyone feels like they helped shape it. And next week, same time, it is streaming all the same places and ways, so you can join in. So yeah. Thank you all of you for being here. So I'll let Brian, you can benedict us out tonight.
Thanks. I would just want to say what phenomenal questions. The discussion in the chat has been fantastic. You all are amazing. It's been a pleasure. Sorry, I've been coughing and all the rest, but hopefully by next week I'll be in better shape. I just want to reiterate this idea that the fact that so many of us are feeling conflicted religious identity, the fact that so many of us can't just keep going with the status quo. What if that is a really amazing sign? What if we actually, the fact that we're having this conversation is a sign of real encouragement? What if your outrage and your frustration and your refusal to go along with the status quo, what if that is a very hopeful sign? I'll leave that with you and hope that will continue to push and surge and motivate our conversation forward.
All right. So thank you all. We will see you next week.